In this podcast, I'm sharing my passion and curiosity for soft robotics, where we share inspiring stories about the work we do and how we can push the limit. I am Mara Dwayne, and this is Soft Robotics Podcast.
I would like to ask you first how you see the development of actuation, because we have a recent paper also in Science Robotics that we have to avoid soft for the sake of being soft all the time. So when you see this kind of actuation technique developed in the field, what is your thought about what might be limitation or what could be area or direction we have to consider when we design the actuation for soft system?
Yeah, good question. And I think we do have to avoid trying to getting carried away with the hype and excitement about things that move. Relatively easy to do, but I think the important thing is that we're trying to develop a technology, a useful technology. So it really comes down to what kind of applications are we trying to fulfill and matching the technology, artificial muscle, soft actuators, to those technologies. And I guess what I've discovered along the way is that every time there's an advance in the performance of artificial muscles, it kind of opens up new applications. But the real ones that we're after, the real applications like wearable robotics or miniature flying machines and so on, I think they're still a long way away. We've got a long way to go to get the actuators to meet those kind of requirements.
Mm-hmm. And do you think I don't know if you agree with that, but do you think sometimes it's hard to understand how artificial muscles work and how to fabricate them? Um, I don't know, generally speaking, in the field, do you think we like this kind of understanding how we can use the material, or, for example, the trade-offs we have in the design? What could be this kind of unavoidable trade-offs? Because, for example, you're already one of the fathers for polymers, and so, for example, the IBs, they have already this kind of trade-offs, and sometimes there's avoidance to them because of the lacking the desired functionalities or understanding how we can pushing their capabilities. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, it's a tough challenge, isn't it? I mean, there are trade-offs for sure, and there's multiple goals, and targets and performances that we have to try and meet to make it useful. It's not just the technical side of it, but it's also just the obviously the economics, and I think also the complexity. One of the things that was, I guess, perhaps a bit surprising to me, but the accessibility to some of these technologies, if you can sort of go to really simple materials and that are readily available, then it really does make it more accessible to engineers and even hobbyists and certainly companies to start playing around with those materials and those systems. If they're exotic materials, well, it's great for academia, but it's really a barrier to get them out into the real world. So it's a challenge to meet all those simultaneous requirements to be met if we're going to get this technology out there.
And what could be the kind of question we should ask in that case, if you mentioned it's a challenge? Because I think that's something also, I think at the community for next decade, we try to consider this point in particular. What do you think maybe we have to consider? Maybe we have to answer certain questions so that we can have this transition from the lab to real application, if we speak about artificial muscle, for example.
Yeah, okay. So for artificial muscle to get into real applications, it's like all technologies, it's got to be cost effective. It's got to do the job at a price that is better than the existing technologies. It's not simply just a matter of, yeah, we can do it, but, in the hard world of business, it's got to be cost effective. So we really have to be, well, if we're interested in that translation, we really have to think about cost, and that's also manufacturability and all the associated aspects around, the lifetime, the recyclability, the energy costs, the sustainability issues as well. I mean, we have to be conscious of all those things. That's the end game. There's certainly still room for doing the more fundamental early stage technology development. We're exploring new materials, and some of them are quite expensive and exotic. That's okay. There's still a role for doing that. That's for sure. But ultimately, if we are at the end where we're trying to get into technology and application, then those business imperatives around making sure it's cost effective and sort of friendly are really important.
That's a very good point. Yeah. So coming back to your paper about using DNA supercooling, if you can tell us, just for audience maybe first time listening, about what is actually DNA supercooling and why you thought about using this in artificial muscle. Yeah.
The history to this particular paper in Science Robotics was and goes back, well, a few years, to the work of then PhD student Nicola Martino, who's now Dr. Nicholas Martino. He, in his fairly early stages of his PhD, observed an interesting phenomenon with some hydrogel fibers that he was making. They were twisted yarns made of polyacrylic acid hydrogel, and of course, like all hydrogels, they like to absorb a lot of water and swell. Right? He was looking at what happens if you make electrospun nanofibers and twist them into a yarn and then swell them. And we predicted that they would, when they swelled, they would want to untwist, and they did. And we had some experience in those kind of structures before. But then what he did, he glued the two ends of the yarn to a glass slide and then put it in the water. And this time it formed a loop, and the loop wrapped around itself and produced what we now know as supercoils. And we thought, wow, that looks pretty cool. Started looking into it. And of course, nature's got there before us. And it turns out that DNA, double-stranded DNA molecules do this supercoiling as a way to pack into the cell nucleus. And they do it in a very organized way and very efficiently pack very long lengths of molecules into a cell nucleus. So we knew that if it's done there in nature, then it must be a pretty useful mechanism.
What could be the feature when we try to use the material here, for example, DNA versus other materials, smart materials? What could be capability gain, or maybe something also limitation as well?
Well, we knew that from some studies on, some pretty cool studies actually, the biologists do on single DNA molecules. Now, just think about that for a moment. They're actually able to grab the ends of a single molecule and do tensile tests on them, which is pretty amazing, really. And we knew from some of their published work, from Ralph Sadell, for example, his labs, that they could make those molecules supercoil, and that means that they reduce their end-to-end length quite a lot, like 80%. And we were able to calculate that they were generating quite a lot of mechanical work on a mass basis, actually better than muscle. So that was exciting. I'm not sure that DNA molecules actually use that mechanism to do work in our cells, but we were excited by the fact that it was possible. Now, of course, DNA has a lot of limitations as well. It's needs its biological environment to operate in, and so on. And the mechanism for making it swell requires it to be exposed to some particular molecule, small molecules that slot inside the DNA double strand and make it want to untwist and then supercoil. So those things weren't convenient to us. We, of course, were interested in making macro scale artificial muscles, not at the molecular level. We are interested in trying to make millimeter or even larger lengths, certainly tens of millimeter lengths of fibers that we could use and test. So we wondered whether the mechanism that DNA does at the molecular level would actually translate to the larger level. And so, and we, luckily it does, but we didn't know that to begin with.
Great. Maybe a quick question about the topology of the design. How do you see the morphology or the topology representation when it comes to the way the mechanism is working? If you can tell more about that.
Yeah. The morphology is absolutely critical, and it's quite simple. It's just having a fiber composite. So we've got a fiber and a matrix. The matrix is something that can swell, so it can change its volume. And it can do that anyway. We chose to use a hydrogel that absorbs water and swells a lot. But it could be done, it could be done by heat, or it could be done electrochemically, or it could be done in different ways. But anyway, we've got a matrix that swells and contracts on demand, and we've got these fibers. Now, the fibers are stiff, so they resist stretching, and in our case, they have to be helically oriented. So we end up with a rod or a fiber in which there are filaments that are all twisted together and helically oriented and held together by this swellable matrix. That is all you need. And if you then make the volume of the matrix change, say expand, that will act against those helically oriented fibers, causing them to want to untwist. And that will happen if the ends are free to move. But if you block that from happening, then the twist is relieved by forming loops and coiling and shortening. And that's the supercoiling mechanism that we describe in the paper.
Yeah. I guess just keep about the forces, maybe all the strain reduced. Do you see the way the mechanism for swelling, for example? Because I don't know, maybe student could ask about that. Could be limitation, for example, the mechanical performance when we have the swelling mechanism. I don't know, do you think maybe other mechanism, just me student curious about other mechanism that can be used that we can, the tensile or the forces, or it doesn't affect at all in this mechanism?
Oh, no, it is important. It's in our particular case, and I'm not saying that's the only way to do it, but in our particular case, the matrix on its own, it would swell about 16 times, 15, 16 times, right? In all directions. So it's the volume change is 16 times. So in any one direction, it's about, what is it, about 2.3 times in isotropic swelling. Now, you put that same material in this twisted composite that I just described, and that then means that it swells in the diameter direction, sort of around 3 times. But of course, with this supercoiling, it collapses in the length direction by 90%. So it's down to only 10% of its original length. So they're the kind of strains that you can get out of it. So you translate effectively a smallish volume change to something that in one direction can be huge. Now, that's the way we did it. There would be other ways to do it for sure, and perhaps some of those are more convenient.
Yeah, and for application, if we won't use that, do you think about encapsulation will be a problem in that case? If we have to encapsulate that in liquid medium, would be also a challenge, or?
Yeah, look, that's for sure. I mean, I think one of to be frank, one of the limitations of the work that we've published is that to take it to applications needs a fair bit of work. We did show that you could attach these composite fibers to some micro tools like tweezers and scissors and so on, that I think is a good application area for people who are interested in micro tools, for say minimally invasive surgery. But of course, to actuate ours, we had to immerse them in water, and then to reverse it, we have to dry them out. Or in fact, what we were able to do is use an acid solution to cause the volume to shrink, and a base solution to cause it to expand. So we could swap those solutions. That's all right in a petri dish, but it's a bit difficult to do, inside the body. So if you want to do that, we would have to encapsulate it all, and we'd have to have a way to deliver acid and base solutions to the muscle. Now, that's a big limitation. So that's why I think for real applications using this mechanism, we would look for other ways to generate the volume change. For example, maybe we can use thermal expansion and things like electrical joule heating to get the thermal expansion. We haven't done that. That's maybe a good suggestion for some of your listeners.
Yeah, great. I'm curious about the fracture or the redundancy resilience in the mechanism. If there's failure happening, how likely it could resist this kind of cyclic load, or this kind also resisting damages if this damage happening?
Yeah, look, that's always a problem, isn't it? Because we're inducing really large strains in these artificial muscles, and a lot of materials don't like to be, they don't want to strain that much. So it is a challenge. And in fact, we went through quite a lot of different fibre and hydrogel combinations before we found one that was quite resilient. Typically what we found was that with many of the combinations of, we were looking at natural fibres and lots of synthetic fibres and carbon fibres and all sorts of other fibres, and also different types of hydrogels. Typically what we found was that they certainly underwent the supercoiling contraction, but then they wouldn't go back the other way. They would just stay like in a tight knot. Some of them were quite brittle. That was one of the main limitations with the original hydrogel yarns. They were very brittle. So we ended up with something that was certainly reversible, which was important, and could survive for certainly many tens of cycles without any damage, probably more, but we didn't test for that long. So, but I'm for sure there would be some of the issues around that plague really all fibre composites, like delamination of the fibres in the matrix. I wouldn't be surprised if we tested many thousands of cycles, that would end up being the limitation of the particular designs that we were using.
Yeah. I'm curious to ask you if there's any feature after done this paper, is there any feature or functionality you wished you could have in DNA supercooling? I don't know, is something you sort of maybe you try to enhance it in the coming paper? I don't know what kind of salts. I just need to use this feature, this functionality.
Yeah, well, we'd love them to go a lot faster, that's for sure. So the last phase of Dr. Nicholas Martino's PhD was to produce this mechanism in composite nanofibers. Well, they're really micron-sized fibers. He spent a lot of time electrospinning different fibers and then twisting them together, and this became really quite tricky experiments, because you're now talking like a few tens of micron diameter fibers, and they're quite difficult to even see, let alone do mechanical tests on. But he was able to show that certainly you can, by downsizing the diameter, you could get them to go faster. I wish that we could do that fast response in macroscopic fibers, because they're obviously a lot more useful. So that functionality would be great. That remains a bit of a challenge though at the moment.
Yeah. So maybe I'm curious about, before doing this project, I don't know if there's something you thought about that's kind of the expectation, how it would work. Is there something was surprising or counterintuitive? Because sometimes we think that system should work in a certain way, or I don't know if there's something you have, because you're also doing the modeling part. It seems that very good for in the paper, that the result, but I don't know if there's any scenario you have that you didn't expect this behavior, or counterintuitive, and very crucial for understanding sometimes.
Well, yeah, look, again, that going back to that first observation of the coiling, that was really counterintuitive. We were wondering what the heck's going on there, but at the same time, it felt familiar. If you got the, your earbuds, you got any cable or fiber or rope or anything, it twists up, right? If you twist a cable, it's going to form these supercoils. So, it was familiar. We see it every day. It's mostly a pain in the neck, really. It causes the fibers and cables and things to tangle. The difference here, the thing that made it really interesting, was that this was happening without us inserting any twist. It was just happening by swelling. And that's what sort of really was surprising, but it also created a lot of interest. We started thinking, hey, this is really interesting. Let's try and find out some more about it. That led us to the DNA, and the biological community have done a lot of modeling on DNA. And it was interesting because the precursor to their modeling come from this, way back in the 70s and 80s, where engineers had been modeling twisting and supercoiling in, like undersea communication cables and ropes and things like that. So there was a good body of mechanics already established that went to the DNA biology, biophysics community, and then we were able to, to draw a lot of knowledge from that body of work and add a little bit to it to explain what we were seeing.
Great. So when you look to proudly look to the community, what do you see that technology group looks when it comes to artificial muscle? So you have been working for many years, and now we still there's lots of sprint. But what could be technological group looks? Do you think when it comes to designing artificial muscle in general?
Ooh, yeah, well, I guess the roadblocks are still, you know, well, they're different for every material, I guess. You know, there's you know, there's always and every time you solve one problem, there seems to be the next one crops up, right? So and whether how long it takes to get past that roadblock sort of is almost random. You know, we all work hard and we all have lots of ideas. A lot of those ideas lead to nothing. And then, you know, sometimes you see some strange results and that takes you down an unexpected path. So I think as scientists, we just got to be open, you know, keep our minds and eyes open to these kind of things. For these particular supercoiling artificial muscles, the roadblocks are really around trying to get them out of the liquid environment if possible, so they still work in a more convenient way. And I suppose if you look at any type of artificial muscle, you know, and I've been involved with a few of them, each of them sort of has the next challenge that we're trying to solve, and whether it might be efficiency or it might be lifetime or it might be cost. You know, there's always something that keeps us up at night and, well, exercises our brains and motivates us really to carry on.
And when it comes to sensing, I don't know, what do you think? Because also in the community, there's a lot of charge about sensing. So incorporating sensing with a mechanism like that, how do you envision it? Or, I don't know.
Yeah, I wonder what DNA does. That'd be the interesting thing. I bet you nature's figured that out too. But you know, if you combine sensing and actuation, then you've got a system, and that makes it you know, something that becomes more again and overcomes one of those roadblocks, doesn't it? That you can start to look at applications. I don't know. We haven't looked at whether the supercoiling process introduces an element that we could detect. We just simply haven't looked at it. It wouldn't be surprising if there was some sort of change in electrical properties if we had a conductive element in there that we could use for sensing. So that would be a good idea. I think that would be a good project to look into.
Since we're close to end, I have a few questions. The first one about the modeling, because I think when we come to design process, still may be curious, what could be the first step in the modeling? Or which level I have to go for? What kind of significant parameter I have to consider? Then you're dealing with all these parameters, which one you have is beginning to come up with a model that can give you insights about the design process?
Yeah, I think the modeling is absolutely essential to do alongside the experiments and to guide the experiments ultimately. And that's why, we spend a fair bit of time thinking about trying to get models to work. The question that we kept asking ourselves was, do we have the optimum structure here? We could see that we were getting some samples that were collapsing in length by supercoiling and generating quite good work outputs, but were we near the optimum? We didn't know. We wondered whether it was possible. Maybe if we had a different combination of materials, we might get even better performance. You don't know that. I mean, you could spend all your time just doing more and more experiments, but there's limited hours in the day. So if you have a model that predicts things, then it has to, of course, be verified by experiments. So you need some experiments to start with. So that was the approach we took. And we just simply asked the question, how do you maximize the amount of mechanical work you get out of this system? And that's what our model ultimately tries to do. And it certainly explains a lot of things. And I think there's scope to explore those models further to make even better samples.
And when it comes to maybe ideas, when you try to see them, sometimes if you think about the crazy ideas, I don't know, some thoughts you have about integrating other materials or multi-material, I don't know. I'm just assuming if you have any crazy idea that you think you wish you can do when it's this project.
Yeah, well, there is a question that came out of the model actually that I'd love to pursue, and that was that we found that there was this trade-off between the diameter of the fiber that you were dealing with. You know, what is the ideal diameter? And it turns out that there's a trade-off that if you go to really small diameters, fibers, then you can put a lot more twist into them before they, you know, they undergo their own twist-induced coiling. And the more twist you put in, when it swells, the more supercoiling you get. So that suggests it's better to go really small diameter. But then on the other hand, if you go to a large diameter, you need less swelling to get the supercoiling. So you effectively get more supercoilings for the same degree of swelling. So the question was, well, what's better? Do you go small diameter or large diameter fibers? Now, the theory says it doesn't matter. You get the same stroke and work output regardless of the diameter. However, that assumes that the strength of the fiber doesn't change with diameter, because the strength ultimately limits how much twist you can put in. And but we do know that from material science, materials get stronger the smaller you make them. So I think there's an opportunity to go to really fine diameter, high strength fibers, twist them up more than you would be able to do based on the fact they've got a higher strength, and then you should actually get better performance if they're made into these composites that we describe in the paper. So that's there's a little prediction, sort of. It's like a speculation more than a prediction that, you know, I wish I had some time to follow up.
That's very, very interesting point. Yeah. So yeah, that's because we close the end. I don't know if you have any thoughts about as a student about publication, because sometimes you have to pressure to publish sometimes, and that's something increasing. And at the same time, you need to ask the right question and come up with the right problems. And it's hard to come up with the right questions sometimes. But what would be advice you give so that you can balance between what you're doing, you're really passionate about, and also publishing material?
Yeah, look, it is a tug of war, really, isn't it, between the need to get the publications out and ultimately the quality of the publication. Obviously, the more work you can do, then the paper is going to have more value. I think this particular example is interesting because it goes back. This particular paper that we published just a couple of weeks ago actually started with about 5 years ago. So it's taken that long to get it out. It took all of Dr. Nicolas Martino's PhD time, and then he finished and he got his doctorate, with an excellent thesis, but we still haven't published the paper. And then I went into the lab myself with help from a couple of my colleagues, and I was doing some of the last experiments and trying to get the model working and so on with my colleagues. And so we just felt like this was we could have published early on. We could have published the observations without the model, without the optimum performance. We just felt it was important enough to pursue and hold off publishing until we had the full story. So it took a long time. I wish it was a bit quicker. But, I think in the end, I'm very proud of the paper that we've just published. I'm grateful that we've been able to publish it.
What is the best advice you have ever received?
Me personally?
Yeah.
Okay, well, it was back when I was contemplating doing a PhD. So I had finished my undergraduate and I was in between, and I was just doing a summer vacation job at a plastics plant. And my boss, I said to him, look, what do you think I should do? And his advice was, get the highest education that you possibly can. So I think that was good advice. I think, because he said, nobody can take it away from you, and you should try and achieve the highest education standard that you're capable of. And that is always beneficial. I think education always helps. So
Absolutely.
I went and did a PhD.
I don't know if you have any final words you'd like to say for the audience. Any final words you'd like to say?
Oh, look, I just hope that people find that it's an interesting story, and that, I think if they find fulfillment and, in the curiosity-driven sciences, and I think that would be great. And I thank you, Marwa, for doing such a great job in promoting what we do. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks so much. Such a pleasure to have you and always listening to you. It's very enjoyable, interesting, Professor Jeff. Thank you. Thank you.